morning, everyone. We're here with Matt Friedman of the MeKong Club on the ESG in 5 podcast. We're really glad to have Mr. Friedman here. He's an expert in the field of human trafficking and modern slavery. He's going to be talking to us a bit about those issues today. Matt, thanks for coming on today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
So if we could first start with you telling us a little bit about what you do and what the MeKong Club does. And I would imagine for you to give us a description of who you are and what you do, you might want to give us also a bit of background on the issue of forced labor and human trafficking, modern slavery.
Very good. I'll start with that. So according to the United Nations, it's estimated there's 50 million people in modern slavery around the world. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. When we talk about modern slavery, we're also talking about human trafficking and forced labor. These terms are often used interchangeably. A couple of other interesting facts: about 25,000 people enter per day, and about 9.2 million per year. The profits generated from this trade is about $150 billion. So you can see why this is a topic that would be of interest to the private sector. Banks have to be concerned about this because of money laundering. Manufacturers have to be concerned about this because of the possibility of there being sweatshops within their supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. The number of people who are helped annually is about 100,000 out of 50 million. That means around 0.2%. So with all the United Nations, NGOs, and governments combined, we're not having much of an impact. And that's part of the reason why the private sector's been brought in. So I've been working on this topic for about 35 years. I started my career with USAID, US government's kind of development arm. I was based in Nepal for 8 years. At that time, I was finding girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive, couldn't understand what was going on, went to interview them, heard how they were tricked and deceived and forced into brothels in India. At that time, human trafficking didn't even have a name. We thought maybe it was just a problem between those two countries, but as we shined a light all over the world, we came to realize that this was a problem all over the world. Then went to Bangladesh, worked there for 5 years, focused on both forced labor, sex trafficking, eventually to Bangkok, where I ran one of the largest counter-trafficking programs in the world, offices in China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar. And then about 10 years ago, set up the MeKong Club. The MeKong Club is an organization that works with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way in order to help them to understand the issue of human trafficking and the nexus of this particular topic with organizations. Once again, why would the banks be concerned? Because if any of that $150 billion gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering. One bank in Australia was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars because they didn't pay attention to this. Manufacturers, if your company is put into a newspaper article that profiles modern slavery, can have a devastating impact. And so investigative journalists are looking for this. If they find it, then it creates a problem. And so a lot of companies are looking to find ways of ensuring that their websites, their businesses are not tainted by modern slavery. Hospitality sector. In the United States, if a sex trafficking victim is used in a motel, hotel, and that person is rescued and they know where they were used, these locations are being sued. And those cases are being won. The insurance company then doesn't want to insure the hotel industry. So all of these are factors. And so what we basically do is educate the corporations. We give them training, we give them consultation. If they run into issues and problems, we help them to understand it. And as a result of this process, we opened up a new front in addressing modern slavery.
That's a very comprehensive answer, Matt. I know you're on the roadshow quite often giving this presentation, so you've got it down very well, and I appreciate that. One small question I have, maybe not small, but kind of relatively specific, is I notice oftentimes I see, for instance, I think it's the ILO will talk about 28 million people in forced labor conditions. Mm-hmm. Do you have any reason why the figure's different or the figures vary?
Okay, so when we talk about modern slavery, there's two big categories. One is forced labor, which is the 28 million that you're referring to. The rest are forced marriages. These are women or men in some cases, that are forced to marry into a scenario where within the family they are forced to work. So you could have, for example, a woman who's forced into a Bangladesh marriage. She's not there to be a wife and to be a mother and so forth. She's there to basically go and work at a garment factory, and all the money comes in. And at the same time, she basically does all the cleaning and the cooking and everything else. Now, the difficulty with that type of forced labor is that it's within the family confines. And so it's really difficult to kind of engage, because people say, well, she's my wife. You know, if I wanted to work this way, then I have the right to do that. So much of what we hear related to human trafficking focuses more on the forced labor that the ILO talks about, and less on the forced marriage, because there isn't much that people can do about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not necessarily linked to international commerce as directly as it would be to.
In fact, it has no connection at all, really. Mm-hmm. It's completely separate and completely isolated and very difficult to address.
One question, you probably get this often. So your name's the MeKong Club, so that obviously harkens back to Southeast Asia, but you mentioned your work in South Asia as well. I would expect that these issues are relevant throughout the world. Is the MeKong Club restricted to that part of the world, or do you have capabilities and all over the world?
Well, actually, we work all over the world, and partly post-COVID, what happened when we were kind of going online, people from New Zealand and Australia and Europe and North America said, well, if you're going to have meetings and it's going to be online, can we join in? The issues related to human trafficking, modern slavery are the same all over the world. There are probably 8 or 10 profile type descriptions or typologies of what happened. So it doesn't matter whether it's here in Asia or elsewhere. Actually, the interesting thing about the name is, so I was, as a UN official, flying up to Hong Kong to better understand what was happening related to modern slavery. This is about 12 years ago. And we would meet with captains of industry and say, here's the issue. Do you know anything about it? They'd say, don't know much about it, recognize the business risk, but I don't want to have a conversation with somebody like you. You come from that naming and shaming and world. So over time, there were enough companies that said, we need an organization in Hong Kong. But when it came to naming it, they said, don't put human trafficking or human rights in the name. It'll scare us away. You know, people are going to ask, why are you going to that company? Do you have a problem? So the Mekong River goes through China and Southeast Asia. Initially, that was our playground. Club seemed like a gentle term. And so we called it that. It's worked well for us. But in some ways, I think it's going to change to TMC International or something, because as we start getting into Africa and Latin America and so forth, it becomes confusing for the people we work with.
Fair enough. Well, it didn't confuse me as much as I wanted to give you the chance to clarify the issue. Another point, kind of tangential to the naming and shaming point, and this is something we've discussed previously, is a key issue that's perhaps an impediment to some of the work you do, is this notion that companies are reticent to report issues where they identify human rights abuses because it might lead to reputational damages. But as a matter of fact, when you read reports, for instance, impact assessments that show 0 incidents of violations over the course of a year period, that says more about the testing parameters than it does necessarily the working conditions. I mean, would you agree that there needs to be a reflection on how we view incidences of forced labor that companies report?
Well, okay, according to legislation that exists around the world, California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, UK Modern Slavery Act, the Duty of Diligence in France, the Australian Human Trafficking Act, all of them basically are moving in the direction of ensuring that as part of your submission of transparency reports that are sent off to governments, you have to include whether or not you found cases related to modern slavery. Now, as you rightly pointed out, if a company states that, the potential for somebody coming and wagging a finger and saying, well, look at, you're bad because you have this, is there. But it seems to be having a different kind of response. And let me give you a couple of nuances related to this. So There was a big electronics company, I'm not going to mention them, that basically about 15 years ago did a report to identify whether or not they found child labor in their supply chains. And they did. And then they said, okay, well, we're going to address it. And they thought that by doing this, it would set the tone and the pace for other organizations to do the same thing. But as it turned out, it backfired. And people said, well, you have kids in your supply chains. That's a terrible thing. And so it created a chilling effect. But a couple of years later, Patagonia came out and said, we looked at our supply chains and we found modern slavery and we're going to address it. And people applauded that. In fact, I had public relations companies coming to me saying, we can't get anyone to give a quote as to whether this is good or bad because nobody really knows what the answer is. My response was, it's great. Let's do that. You had Nestle that came out and said they found modern slavery and it worked out okay. And the reason is that people assume that there's modern slavery in these supply chains. And by these companies admitting it and saying it, it's perceived as them being honest and transparent related to this. So there is more of an acceptance that you can go and talk about these cases as long as you demonstrate after you find these things that you're going to do something to fix it. And people respect that and accept that because, again, they assume it's there already.
Yeah, that's a great point. It shows that you're actually doing the work to fix the problem when you're actually reporting honestly, because then you can track and then you can address. We often ask on the show what's one of the key problems that you address, and I think we've talked about that a bit. But maybe we could talk a bit more about the work you do at the MeKong Club. Is it mainly focused on education? So is it educating employees at companies how to spot risks of forced labor and other types of human rights abuses, how to address it? Or is it related to, does it involve facilitating remediative efforts when human rights issues are discovered?
It's all of those, but let me talk about kind of the big issue is a lack of general awareness. Companies, just like perhaps you would know a certain amount about human trafficking, modern slavery from just seeing articles and newscasts and so forth, but in your mind, you may not have a template. So what we try to do is to initially help companies to understand the relationship between what is modern slavery and human trafficking, how did it become a private sector issue, and then specifically, depending upon their sector, what is it that they need to do? So we have an association. It includes about 60 of the major companies around the world. It includes banks, manufacturers, retailers, the hospitality sector, tech sector, a lot of other different groups as well. And the first thing we do is create awareness within the organization. We then do a baseline to determine where they are in their journey to address modern slavery. It looks at, does C-suite know about this? Do they have policies and procedures? Do they offer training? Do they have point people, risk assessments? How do they do their auditing, et cetera, et cetera? And then based on that assessment, we work with them to identify what they need to do in order to address the issue. We also bring these individuals in these organizations together on a quarterly basis to debate and discuss and identify what they think is needed to address the issue. And then we develop tools. It could be a dashboard, it could be an app, it could be an analysis, it could be a training. And then we give those back to the community so that they're able to address this. There's also a lot of discussion related to ESG, as you could imagine. Post-COVID, ESG is on steroids, and you have lots of organizations that are attempting to kind of figure out, well, what is it that we say? How do we say it? Well, what's the extent to which we address the S in ESG? And so we spend a lot of time providing consultation related to that. And lastly, when companies find something that is problematic, we sign an additional NDA, and then we sit down with them and figure out what they need to do in order to fix it.
Yeah, that leads right into my next question. Where do you find yourself working with lawyers the most and liaising with lawyers? Is it dealing with particular incidents as they arise, or helping to develop frameworks that comport with the various regulatory regimes, or a bit of both? Managing communication strategies vis-a-vis ESG regulations?
First time we generally see lawyers is when they are attempting to onboard us. Here's an NGO working with the private sector. And so we have to kind of answer their questions about how do we address confidentiality, privacy, and so forth. Oftentimes when transparency legislation submissions are being given, we are asked to review them, and that gets us in front of lawyers. When a remediation situation happens, obviously you would have counsel in the room to discuss the parameters of the options and what needs to be done and so forth. Often the legal people have questions about legislation. What should we do? What shouldn't we do? What's the extent to which we have to report? What's the minimum? What's the maximum? All those types of things. So we worked with a lot of different lawyers on these topics. Okay, just to give an example, I was in Japan and I was invited to a car company to do a presentation. It was the corporate social responsibility person who brought me in. Took a train from Tokyo to Yokohama. When I got there, after about 10 minutes, I talked a little bit about legislation. She made some calls because she recognized that they weren't doing what they needed to do. 90 minutes later, I have 4 lawyers in the room taking copious notes, a couple of comms people, an ESG person, and a few others basically kind of trying to figure out what it was that they should be doing that they hadn't been doing. So oftentimes, the legal people don't know what the lay of the land is in terms of what the requirements are. And once they find it, then they realize that we have to be in compliance. We're going to get ourselves in trouble. And so we focus on that with the legal counsel as well.
Yeah, that's a key focus of this show and a lot of my work is just to educate and give broader awareness to the kind of general legal community of all of these new regulations. Most people think of these as corporate social responsibility, soft law issues, but oftentimes they're hard law issues. And just because your activities are in a certain region or related to a certain type of product or service, there can still be potential liability risks. One thing you mentioned was hotels and services or hotels industries in the United States. Now, most people would think that issues related to modern slavery and risks of company exposure to modern slavery would be localized in the developing world. But actually, there's still plenty of incidences of human rights abuses, modern slavery in the developed world, and arguably, it's more likely that those issues will be discovered and will lead to litigation or other types of reputational risk for the company. So the idea that you should only focus on issues in the developing world is not really on point.
Last fall, I did a 53-day consecutive presentation tour across Canada and the East Coast of the United States. 91 presentations, 1,200 companies, 12,000 people. And I'd say less than 10% of the people that I presented to knew even 25% of what I was talking about. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to address it. If you don't address it, you're not going to do anything. The United States knows less than what you would see, for example, here in Asia, because of exactly what you said. They think of it being far away. But according to the United Nations, somewhere between 400,000 and I would describe 1 million people in the United States would be in modern slavery. That includes sex trafficking victims, that would include agriculture people, domestic helpers, construction, et cetera, et cetera. If you're below the radar, you're not supposed to be there, you can be taken advantage of. So you're absolutely right. The issues related to modern slavery exist within developed countries because people are trying to get from less developed countries to developed countries. And by doing that, they get into the hands of smugglers and traffickers and they have debt. And as a result of that, this translates into the person basically being owned by somebody else. So it's a huge problem. And, in North America, there has to be so much more work in order to sensitize people to this fact.
Yeah, especially people talk about the waves of immigration all the time and the waves of illegal immigration. They don't always acknowledge that the waves of illegal immigration also have with it the risk that those illegal immigrants are going to be taken advantage of. So to the extent that we understand and appreciate that there's significant amounts of immigration into the developing world, into the developed world rather, it also demonstrates a risk that those immigrants will be subject to conditions of forced labor, debt bondage.
Yeah, there was an article that came out a couple of months ago, New York Times, related to child labor among migrants that crossed over the border. So you're talking about kids basically cleaning up in slaughterhouses and doing various other activities. It was a relevant, important article because what it did is it kind of shined the light on the fact that, yeah, we have similar situations of sweatshops that you would see in different parts of the world, Asia, Africa, and so forth.
Yeah, I remember they talked mainly in the Midwest, where those industries are localized. This is really interesting. This is a fun tangent that I didn't expect to go on, but a lot of the issues that we're interested in are the types of laws that are relevant to these topics and the types of areas where lawyers need to be educated on so that they can properly advise their client as to different risks.
Well, let me talk a little bit about that. What's interesting about transparency legislation, and the first one was in California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, basically says if you have profits of $100 million in retail and manufacturing in a single product in California, you got to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. So while the law is in California, it affects Japanese companies, it affects German companies, Canadian companies, because if you're working in that location, you have to basically do something. The UK Modern Slavery Act goes further. Companies that are working in the UK that of 36 million pounds basically have to have an annual report that describes various components of what they're doing to address modern slavery. And that has to be signed by their board of directors. The Australian one goes even further, which basically says that there's going to be an inventory. The government's going to review these, send them back if it isn't meet a particular standard. The German one that just came into play has fines and penalties. The Canadian one will go even further. So with each kind of incarnation of transparency legislation, more bells and whistles are added. And as a result of that, you have more and more potential reputational risk, liability associated with if you don't do something related to this, you're going to get yourself in trouble.
Yeah, and people should understand that the California Transparency Supply Chains Act, I think that was enacted in 2010. And so that's the first incarnation of laws, which can be categorized as saying, if you have a policy, please explain the policy to us.
Yeah.
But then the later incarnations of laws are actively saying you must perform human rights due diligence. And then they're beginning to explain what we expect appropriate human rights due diligence procedures will be. And failure to utilize those procedures will result in fines. So you're seeing a gradual increase in the obligations that companies have vis-a-vis human rights in their supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the trend that we're going to see over time. Now, a lot of people kind of complain, I'm a huge company and, we have to do the California one, we have to do the UK one, the German one and everything. Can't we consolidate it? The reason why governments go through this process of putting the legislation in place is because they want the process of putting the legislation to be as important as the outcome. It helps to sensitize companies, educate companies, give them a sense of what it is that the problem is. And so the Canadian version, which hasn't crossed over the line, SB 211, and it's very close to being law, it took a couple of years to get companies to give their feedback, to understand what was happening and so forth. And that's a relevant, important part of the process of helping to educate and inform them and prepare
and
them.
it also speaks to the fact that, companies can often say, how can you expect us to adhere to these difficult guidelines? Where the response could be, you could see this coming down the road over the course of the past 5 years. And I feel like part of our job as lawyers is to give companies an understanding of the status of the law as it is today, but have an understanding of the history of the evolution of the law such that we can give predictions on where the law is going to be in 5 years so that they can put frameworks in place to adhere to those laws as well.
Yeah, well, it was quite interesting when the UK law was moving forward. All the companies were bitching and moaning and saying, "Oh my gosh, this is so terrible." Then it crossed over the line, and within 15 minutes, they're like, "Okay, what do we need to do? Tell us what we need to do. Give us the guidance." So you have that period prior to the law crossing over the line where you can do whatever you can to influence the direction. But to a certain extent, the compliance requirements of this transparency legislation has worked out well for ESG. And the reason why I say that is that companies that are not responsible for submitting the transparency legislation to these haven't really done what companies who are required to do have. So they already have the data on the S related to modern slavery, forced labor, child labor, all that kind of stuff, because they've been working on it. And they have the statistics. So they're ready to just go in there. And because, when it comes to ESG, prior to COVID, people were cherry picking the indicators and the standard holders and so forth. So if you're an electronics or electric car company, you focus on the E and the G. forget about the S. But
forget the cobalt mines that are producing
it's
the lithium ion
standardized.
batteries, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're going to get dinged because you have cobalt and lithium in there. So, I mean, where the world is going is standardization, oversight. I spoke to government officials in Ottawa and Washington, and the direction, they are like, wow, ESG is amazing. What it does is offers the possibility of a naughty and nice list for companies, and if we get in there and ensure that what they're saying is real, then you're really going to be able to judge which companies are doing right and which are not doing right. And that offers, consumers and investors the opportunity to kind of really look at this and ask questions. Do we want to work with this company or not?
One question that we often ask are there any articles that you've recently been writing on this topic? You mentioned the roadshow that you put on last year, and I was following your posts on LinkedIn where you would just explain we're going to another place and another place and another place. So I appreciate that you're much more of a speaker than a writer, but it's always nice to be able to allow our audience to have some links to some of the work that you're doing in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I would just describe that the evolution of change related to this topic of modern slavery is extremely vibrant and dynamic. Now, we have, for example, on our website, a knowledge hub. If you want to know about any kind of trends that are taking place in banking or in manufacturing or retail or whatever, you just go on the knowledge hub and you put the country and you put the topic and you'll get all the articles you could possibly imagine. So let's say that you were interested in garment factories in India, forced labor. If you did a Google search, you're going to get 2 articles and then a lot of other things that don't mean anything. Because we only collect information related to human trafficking, modern slavery, and so forth, it's homogenized. If you put in India and modern slavery, you're going to get 60 articles. And so that's one way of basically keeping up with things. We recently did a kind of a document with Reuters, amplifying the S in ESG, and it's a MythBuster type document. If you search on that, you can find it. It's a good way of kind of looking at the direction that S is going in related to modern slavery. And a lot of what we do is we do pro bono talks. If a law firm in the United States is interested in a 50-minute talk on human trafficking, we'll do it online, and basically they can tape it and use that. And again, the reason why this is relevant and important is going back to the question of what's the biggest problem. It's a lack of general awareness. As lawyers, you should know about this, not only because, let's say, you're working for a company, but because the world has 50 million people in modern slavery, 25,200 enter per day. And the world is helping 137 a day, 0.2%. This is a relevant topic. It's relevant to us as human beings, to our businesses, to our communities. We should care about this. And that's why awareness raising is so important.
Yeah, we're lawyers, so we're advisors to companies. We're also consumers. We're also voters. All of these things is why it's relevant. Before we go, I'd want to talk a bit more about where you see the future of this legislation going. But one topic I wanted to ask you about a bit is whether or not you ever work with individuals who are tasked with Foreign Corrupt Practices Act compliance. And I know it's a very important topic in the human rights due diligence and the business human rights community, that we don't want these human rights due diligence exercises to devolve into a compliance exercise, because it's much more important that we remediate and address human rights risk rather than just participate in a tick box exercise. But one thing that's interesting is that FCPA programs that companies have put in place, they've devoted substantial resources to them, both monetary resources and employee resources, whereas human rights hasn't necessarily gotten as much attention and focus. But I wonder if there's anything where your work has convened with FCPA practices, or?
Yeah, I mean, I almost look at this as kind of a gumbo soup sometimes. You get corruption and you get bribery and you get modern slavery and human rights all mixed together. And then, each spoonful has one of those things in it. To a certain extent, they're treated as separate, but for the most part, they're very much linked together. Everything related to human trafficking is related to some type of criminal activity. And people forget that. They put this into a category of, it's a compliance question. It's a question related to whether or not
money laundering. You mentioned earlier, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off, but you mentioned earlier, money laundering also comes up, and there's so much anti-money laundering exercises that
we do a lot of kind of discussions where we look at the Venn diagrams where all these things come together and try to figure out, based on that, where are the entry points. Years ago when I was in Bangladesh, I lived there for 5 years, we did this exercise where we brought lawyers together and said, from the point at which a criminal activity takes place related to human trafficking to the actual conviction, what are the steps? And they came up with 30 steps. And then we said, okay, in order to fix this process so that we have more of this taking place, where do we focus? What are the 2 things that we focus on? And they figured out something related to the process of what is it that you use as the arrest and something later. I think what needs to happen is for there to be lawyers coming together from same sectors to really kind of look at that combination of different legal or illegal activities and really have a dialogue and a discussion and to identify, where do you draw a line? Where do you kind of collectively as a community address this? And the reason why I say this is that if you're legal counsel for, let's say, a manufacturing company, and you're dealing with the potential of modern slavery indicators decimating your business, and we've seen that happen, you want to ensure that that doesn't happen, not only for yourself and your own organization, but for others as well. Because if one fashion company gets into trouble, the assumption is everybody else is in the same thing. So a multi-stakeholder approach to address this is basically what we pull together. We bring these people together and we have discussions and we get them to identify what needs to be done. And then as an organization, we are the sound piece to then go off and say, we had these discussions, this is what we came up with, and this is what we think needs to happen within your organization in order to, protect your business and other businesses as well. So fashion companies will compete on everything else, the textiles and the colors and the brand, profiles and so forth. But on human trafficking, they won't. They want to work together. And this is an important kind of point I want to get across.
I was having a conversation a few weeks ago discussing the antitrust issues related to having industry-wide initiatives related to human rights issues, and that we have to have a really sophisticated understanding of how we negotiate antitrust law, but also have a consolidated approach to tackling these issues, because many suppliers, it's often the case that large suppliers have a dozen different brands that they work with, and any one brand doesn't necessarily have the leverage to affect that supplier. But if the 12 brands have some type of industry initiative that comports with antitrust law but still places enough pressure on the supplier vis-a-vis human rights issues, that's something that can be. Yeah.
Well, we're seeing, for example, prior to kind of this legislation, most companies were just auditing at tier 1.
Yep.
Didn't focus on tier 2 or 3 because there was no expectation. Legislation says that you have to go all the way down to the lowest tier. So let's say that you're a shoemaking company and you have been auditing 2,000 tier 1 factories for 30 years. You don't find an issue there. But now the legislation says you have to go to tier 2 where you have the component parts, tier 3, the raw materials. That goes from 2,000 to 10,000 audits. Who's going to pay for that? Is you're going to go from, $100 to $200. And so what's happening is companies are beginning to consolidate their audits, which never happened before. So one company will say, we're all using the same zipper company. We'll do zippers, you do shoelaces, somebody else does rivets, somebody else does textiles. And as a result of that consolidation, we're getting a much more efficient, effective approach, because now for the first time, this mosaic of addressing issues is there. I'll just say one more thing about supply chains. There was a particular cigarette company that basically said, we're a cigarette company. People go after us because of what we sell, but we don't want anything to be perceived as being inappropriate related to forced labor. So they knew everything from their CEO to tier 1 farms, but they didn't know tier 2, 3, 4. So they hired an organization to do a deep dive to see if they found modern slavery, human trafficking. After that, I was at the briefing when this occurred. They said, yeah, we found some kids, we found some forced labor, but that isn't the real news. The news is now we know everything from our CEO to the lowest level, and we understand our entire business. Why didn't we do this before? Why didn't we look at, our supply chains? Because now we saw quality issue, pricing issues, value issues, all kinds of things that allowed us to do things. When prior to globalization, when things were made in the United States, you could see what was happening there. When you did globalization, you went to a Chinese factory, you didn't care where they got the stuff, but now the expectation is you do. Eventually, we will all be at a place where the entire supply chain kind of visibility will be expected, mandated, and legislated, and that's the direction we're going in.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's a better place to be for consumers and for workers around the world.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think that's a great note to end it, Matt. I really appreciate you coming on today and talking about your work, and I really appreciate the work you've been doing for all these years. It's really fantastic stuff.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for highlighting this and giving me the opportunity to talk to you. It was a great interview. Thank you.